there are lots of people born with XXY or XX with strange male testosterone hormones and all that sort of stuff. And there's all sorts of that. But they're like, well, we could call them abnormalities. And they might not challenge our fundamental notions of a kind of bipolarity of normal sex. Let's set aside culturally constructed gender, but let's talk biology.
Right. Well, since you're a philosopher, I'm sure you've heard of the problem of natural kinds.
Yeah, definitely.
And the question is, are there really two natural kinds and everything else doesn't fit into those two? Or are there all of the different things we see in nature, in fact, natural and not abnormal? And to a large extent, we as scientists or as medical professionals make a decision about what we count as normal or not normal based on our social or cultural understandings of what we think the world should look like, rather than on anything that sort of is self-evident from nature.
And let me share with our listeners my understanding of natural kinds.
Sure.
Of course, it comes from nature, and the idea is that nature on its own produces things of various kinds. Now, that's got to be right to some extent. I mean, rocks and grass are quite different. But elm trees and oak trees, well, that's a pretty robust natural kind, but there's lots of distinctions among trees we make that, really are pretty much just the result of the way humans breed trees. So how natural are they?
Yeah, we think that nature has joints, and the job of science is to carve nature up into its pre-given joints.
That's
and
right.
You might think that male versus female is one of biology's pre-given joints.
And as a biologist, I am not particularly convinced that nature has those joints. I think that what we do is, as biologists, is our best to offer good categories that enable us to carry out research projects and enable us to understand the world. But whether those are, in fact, natural joints that the world is carved into, or whether we're imposing them on a world that's quite a bit more complex and messy, I think is an open question. And I'm inclined to say that we're imposing order where there's some order, but less than we think meets the eye.
The way nature works is there are statistical clumps that are quite significant that center around these pure male and pure female paradigms, and the ones in between are, I guess, fairly rare. But how rare are they? What percentage of 100 people would be in a somewhat ambiguous state?
Well, this, of course, depends on who you count as ambiguous. Now, if you count everybody who doesn't quite fit the so-called pure male or pure female, including at the chromosomal level, which is actually quite common, you come up with something approximating 2%, or so it would be, 2 out of 100, which is actually quite high if you think about it.
2 out of 100, as I understand, the Jewish population in America is roughly between 2 and 3%. They make a significant cultural impact. What happens to this 2 or 3%? Why are they not self-identified? Do the members of this percent know that they fit into this group?
They seem pretty invisible in our broader culture. That's a lot of people. If you take the population of the United States, why are they so invisible?
Well, they are invisible, often. Their situation may result from a chromosomal difference that isn't even recognized until something like fertility becomes an issue. So people can grow up being different from that ideal norm and not know it until fairly late in life. If kids are actually born with ambiguous genitalia or some unusual component to their gonads, then they may be diagnosed early in life, and the medical practice is to try to, quote, fix it, to make them conform and to make them invisible because of the pre-existing belief that there should only be 2. So we try to make only 2 even when there's not.
A lot of people in this intersex region probably don't know or aren't vividly aware of the fact that they were born that way, and others probably know and just try to forget it.
That's correct.
And the medical profession helps them by doing these surgeries. I mean, reading your book, it's sort of a catalog of horrors at certain times.
Well, there are many of us who don't believe that the medical profession necessarily helps by doing these surgeries to correct genitalia. The surgeries are imperfect, and they're often done on babies who have no choice in the matter. So the question about whether these surgeries are necessary for the mental health of the child is a really big one, and it's one that's being hotly debated right now within the pediatric surgical world.
And let me ask the question here. Is it always going to be around 2 or 3%? Is there cultural inhibitions to recognizing the reality of this disappear? Will this number increase? Is it hereditary in any
Well,
way?
let me distinguish between intersex and then the dynamics of gender. Intersex is sometimes an accident of birth, it's sometimes genetic, as in those cases it may have very different frequencies in different populations where a particular gene is more frequent or not. But if we go back to this notion that masculinity and femininity, both in body type and in inclination towards particular gender roles or jobs or sports, those kinds of things, represent a huge spectrum of inclinations, there I think there's a huge dynamic change taking place. And we see it both across the board, from jobs that are acceptable to women now that weren't 100 years ago, participation in athletics, to, I would include in this, the changing ideas about marriage. I would include in it the changing concepts of homosexuality.
So look, and I'm going to ask you a more philosophical question. What about the rest of us who have, let's call it standard, I don't know if I want to use the word normal given what you've said, let's call it standard sort of gender and sex identities. I mean, is there any challenge to that from what you're saying? I mean, you could think of it like this, and I'm not sure if you do or don't. You can think of it like people say, well, used to say, racial categories are biological categories. That's nonsense, it turns out. And one of the reasons you can see that is because our concepts of race can't deal with interracial people. It doesn't know what to call them, right? It's completely embarrassed by the phenomena of interracial people. And so you say, well, we should abandon this old race schema. Are you suggesting a similar kind of argument for gender concepts?
There is a similar kind of argument to be made, although the analogy is incomplete. But within people who have what you call the standard set of attributes, there is also huge variability in body type, in interest, in mental and physical inclination, and even in things like how deep your voice is. I mean, I have women friends who have extremely deep voices who would be always mistaken for men, and I know men who have pretty high-pitched voices. So the things we think of as, quote, the standard, what I call the platonic ideal, are just that. They're an ideal that don't particularly match the huge variability within our populations.
I want to distinguish two things and wonder how you think they interact. So you've argued something about the fluidity of, let's call it, biological sex. And then on the other hand, people talk about the cultural construction of gender roles. But does anything directly follow from the cultural construction of gender roles from the fluidity of biological sex?
So it's not quite bipolar, so we need a not quite bipolar social distinction. That's your point. You're not being so strictly philosophical. There is a sense that, gosh, even if the bipolarity of sex breaks down, that does kind of open up the doors for the bipolarity of gender roles.
Well, I don't think constructed roles float free, nor am I a biological determinist. And in fact, the work I'm doing now is aimed at trying to have us understand how there's a constant kind of co-production of the body and culture. If you're a biological determinist, you think the body is fixed and then culture is layered on top of it. In fact, I think that as little children, as we're acculturated into our male or female roles and interests, that's happening via changes in our nervous system, in our body, in our brain. So that distinction between the body and culture, I think, breaks down.
Well, for me, masculinity is a pattern of practice. It's not an attitude, it's not what's in people's heads. It's not the state of their hormones, it's what they actually do in the world. And that's something that has a relationship to your body, to your biology, but not a fixed relationship. So women can behave in a masculine way, though usually it's men who do. And also there are different patterns of masculinity. So different groups of men will conduct themselves in different ways, and those patterns also can change over time. And that, of course, is what we hope to achieve in anti-violence work, because some patterns of masculinity do include a willingness to use violence, whereas other patterns, in comparison, peaceable. And part of the problem of reducing violence in the world is to shift from the first to the second kind of masculinity. Masculinity Masculinities do centrally concern relations between men as a group and women as a group, and of course individual relationships between particular men and particular women. But they also concern relationships among men, so that one of the things research has repeatedly shown in different parts of the world is a kind of hierarchy among masculinities, where in a given community one kind of masculinity is the honoured one, is the top dog, so to speak, the hegemonic pattern of masculinity, and other forms of masculinity, by contrast, are less honoured, more marginalised, perhaps even excluded from respect altogether. There are really quite a range of things that can be done among different groups of men and boys, of course, because boys, many of them in school, many of them in learning situations of one kind or another, are actually in the process of forming their patterns of masculinity. So interventions towards more peaceable forms of masculinity should, I think, definitely include boys as well as adult men. These interventions can take the form of sort of personalised situations where you create a safe space for boys or men to talk about gender relations, talk about their experiences with women, talk about their experiences with other men, and think through what it would be to live in a more peaceable, more democratic kind of way. There are also public policy interventions which might create possibilities of change in masculinity, given that the most violent institutions in the world are states, military, prison systems, police forces. How can we reduce the impact of that kind of organised violence is also part of the problem of changing masculinities.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role. We're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role-playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. Now, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal. So there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
What I found out when I was doing the research for Dude, You're a Fag, I spent about a year and a half hanging out with kids in a high school, and I was struck by how often boys would call one another fag or faggot, and it happened so often that it would echo in my head even when I was not at the research site. And so I started investigating what did they mean when they called one another a fag, because I think, as most people would suspect or have a hunch, I thought that they were calling one another homosexual, that they might as well be saying, you're so gay, or you're actually homosexual. And when I started questioning them about it, boys would say things to me like, it has nothing to do with sexual preference at all. You could just be calling someone an idiot. And so I kind of began to ask them, what sort of things could you do that would get you called a fag? And quickly a list came to the surface. If you danced, if you cared about your clothing, if you were too emotional, or if you were incompetent. And so all of these things they defined as unmasculine. And so what I came to realize was that they used fag as an insult to police the boundaries of masculinity, that it wasn't really about same-sex desire. And in fact, when I asked them about same-sex desire, one boy said, well, being gay is just a lifestyle. You can still throw a football around and be gay. And so that's when I realized that being gay, while wasn't exactly accepted, it wasn't that bad. It was much worse to be an unmasculine man than it was to be a masculine man who desired another man. And so that's what they were really doing with the fag insult, or what I came to call the fag discourse, was that they were policing the boundaries of masculinity and continually, interactionally reminding one another how to be masculine. So I think out of this research comes a couple policy conclusions. When we look at some events in recent history, right, over the past 2 to 3 years, we see a couple things. We see instances such as the death of Carl Joseph Walker Hoover, who was an 11-year-old in Massachusetts who was teased and bullied for being very into academics and was subject to what I would call the fag discourse. And he ended up killing himself because of it. We know of cases of boys who engage in cross-gender behavior, who make public their same-sex desire, and they are either teased for it or sometimes killed for it. We also know that 90% of school shooters who have been subject to homophobic harassment and teasing. So we know that there are consequences to the fag discourse, that most boys don't go to those extremes, but some boys do. And even boys who don't, such as Ricky, who was subject to all sorts of harassment in my book, ended up dropping out of school because he simply couldn't get the protection he needs. So I think that all of that leads us to conclude that we do need to have some policy recommendations, because there are very serious consequences. California has taken a step in the right direction. They passed the California Safe Schools and Violence Prevention Act, in which students are prohibited from teasing one another based on sexual or gender presentation. Very few states have such a law. Massachusetts actually has such a law. And so I think that that sort of bullying and harassment legislation is one of the first steps. I think the other thing we need to see is in teacher training. Most teachers don't recognize this sort of behavior as harassment. They see it as boys will be boys type behavior. They see what goes on between boys and girls as flirting. And so we need to make teachers aware of this sort of behavior and give them tools with which to deal with this behavior.
Well, one of the things we realized very quickly in a multicultural society is that you can't just be talking about gender without talking about race and class and sexual identity. And we learned this from the women's movement. The women's movement started out as talking about women. And then women of color said, well, wait a second, our experience is different.
Right.
And poor and working class women said, wait a second, you can't make generalizations about women without talking about the differences. And we realized that very quickly. We started going into the schools in Oakland and San Francisco, and we went into saying, okay, you're men, and you've got all this power. You're hurting the women around you, which was true. And they were saying, well, we're not powerful. We're men of color. We're poor and working class. We don't have a lot of power in the society.
Yeah.
And so in order for us to talk to them as people, as full range of complex human beings, we had to be talking about all of those issues together. That's part of what led to talking about parenting and teaching and boys and male socialization, but it also led to the work on racism, on economic issues, and looking at why is it that we live in a society where we raise boys to be men who often turn to violence and abuse towards others. What purpose does that serve? Mm-hmm. And what can we do about that? How do we get boys out of that? One of the things we realized very quickly is that there is a general set of training that all boys get. All boys hear this message, act like a man, be a man, right. Grow up. The message is you've got to be tough, aggressive, in control. You can't show any feelings, you can't cry, you're not supposed to make mistakes, and you're never ever supposed to act for help.
This is what you mean by the phrase you use in your workshops called the act like a man box.
Right. It feels like a box. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Be tough, be in control, get in the box. One way we know it's a box is that every time a boy steps out of it, what happens, he starts getting called names, right? Wimp, sissy, girl, mama's boy, fag, punk.
Absolutely get you back in the box. Do
Right,
whatever you have to do.
Well, and what do you have to do? If you're 10, 11, 12, somebody comes up to you and calls you a fag or a sissy or a girl,
right.
What do you have to do to prove you're in the box?
Punch him out.
You have to fight. Part of the enforcement of that box is the fear that boys have of being gay, of being called gay, of appearing to be gay.
Appearing to be gay.
So that's one of the ways that box is enforced, and that's a systematic message. But what we also realized was that box works differently for different boys based on race and class. Mm-hmm. So for instance, two elementary school boys, you know, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, two white boys get into a fight. It's not treated real seriously. You know, boys will be boys, they'll grow out of it, it's just a phase. It's just seen as part of learning how to be in the box. Two African American or Latino boys get into a fight, and all of the stereotypes and fears of the adults come down, and, oh, this is a pattern, we better deal with it quickly, it's going to get out of hand. And so they're going to be disciplined more harshly than the white boys, they're going to be expelled or suspended much quicker. That the reaction to boys trying to be in that box is real different based upon the adult stereotypes and expectations.
You deal with this theme in Boys Will Be Men, that parents have a different set of perceptions and ways of dealing with the fact that they're raising a boy of color or a Caucasian boy or a Latino boy. Talk about that, will you?
Well, it's on the one hand, the boys are getting different responses from the external society.
Society as a whole, right.
Neighbors, friends, teachers, you know, the police. So we have to prepare them differently. The white boys are getting the message that they should be in charge, that they're going to be successful, they should get ahead. The boys of color often get the message that they're dangerous, they're feared, they're not wanted in school, they're not welcome in the school. And so we need to prepare them differently to deal with the racism and economic class expectations that they're going to deal with. Well, why do we have this box? Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at the roles in the society that men are being prepared for. All of the roles in our society that control people, that keep the system in place. Yes. Deans, fathers, police officers, security guards, prison wardens, soldiers, all those controlling roles. The box is training for taking your own pain and fear and anger and confusion and turning around and abusing, controlling, maintaining control over others. However, we know that if we look at our society, that it's stratified by race. And so boys of upper middle and upper class, especially white boys, are being trained to be in control verbally, emotionally, to be in offices, to make decisions that control people's lives without using physical violence. Mm-hmm. Working class and poor white boys are being trained to be in jobs that often are in controlling communities of color, and there aren't jobs for the poorest in our society because our corporations have moved jobs overseas. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of very poor paying service jobs. And so the Act Like a Man box and the racial stratification is preparation for people's roles in society.
Does it matter what class or what race you are with regard to domination and the consequences to battery and violence? Today's paper had a story which said that 1/3 of all women are either battered or raped or violated in their lifetime. Mm-hmm.
Well, and we can see in a society in which most men don't feel like they're going to get to the top, that they feel like that they've been mistreated or they haven't gotten what they're entitled to in some way. What's one of the worst things you can call a boy at school? Girl. Right. Mama's boy, pussy, bitch. Those words that say that women, girls, don't deserve respect, that they're inferior, that if you're angry or confused, one of the legitimate targets that boys are taught is you can turn that towards women. And so this provides an outlet, a relief for men. I may not be as successful as I want to be, but at least I'm not a girl. Or if, in terms of the homophobia that we mentioned earlier, at least I'm not gay. Or if I'm white, at least I'm not a person of color.
So homophobia is this fear that you will be suspected of being girly or sissy, or that you really are same-sex oriented.
Or that you're out of the box, that you're not manly enough, you're not strong enough, you're not successful enough. And so the message is to take whatever fear you have about the box, about not being adequate in the box, and finding somebody to pass on your pain and anger and confusion to.
So it's out of the fear that you become furious, that you will be seen as out of the box, punished for it, that results in men taking their fury out as a manifestation of their fear on those they've been trained to think of as inferior.
Right, or who are vulnerable socially.
And vulnerable.
Now, the thing that often gets confused in people's minds is that a lot of men are legitimately angry at their circumstances. You know, we are missing the box. The training of the box itself is violence that's done against us. A lot of boys are hit, sexually assaulted. A lot of us don't have educational opportunities, don't have good jobs. That's legitimate anger.
Right.
The problem is that the anger gets connected to violence, and we turn around to the people around us, our friends, our family, and take it out on them, rather than thinking about how do we organize, how do we make change, how do we change the system.
When we decided what are we going to teach, we went to the women's groups and said, okay, if we can get these guys for 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 15 or however long we get them, what do you want us to teach them? And out of that eventually came the power and control wheel, those sessions with the women. This was the one that I remember that really got to me. This woman said, if you live with a batterer, it is not cyclical, it isn't something that comes and goes. You live with a batterer every day, even when he's being nice to you, it's a part of the violence. Because if he's raping you and telling you you're no good and you're ugly here, and then 3 days later he's telling you you're beautiful and I need you and I want you, it's all part of the same thing. Don't think it's cyclical. And I went, well, yeah, I never thought that. And, you know, I think I must have said it was cyclical, right? So then I kept saying, well, okay, what else is it like to live with a batterer? And then I remember coming back from that meeting and saying to Coral and Michael, we just got to go to these women's groups and ask these questions. And so we started going, what's it like to live with them? Describe it, and people starting to tell stories, and then we got into the word tactics. Somehow in the process the word tactics came out, and we started asking him, what other tactics does he use against you besides violence? And we never lets us have any friends, so then we'd get all the women to tell a story about that. Who doesn't he let you see when? And then the word isolation started coming up. We lumped all that under isolation. And he's always putting you down and calling you names, and what are all the things he's doing that when they talk about that, and then emotional abuse became that category. And so it came from these stories. If every woman in the room had a story that fit this thing, then we knew it was a core tactic. And we went to about 3, we always had our groups in neighborhoods. So in central Duluth, we had a group going in west and east side. So we went to all 3 of those groups over several months and kept developing this thing over and over. And we'd bring our little designs in. Finally, we came up with the one where we put the violence around the outside and all the other tactics on the inside. We were trying to make it like a wheel where the violence held everything together, and these tactics were all part of a system. The women weren't telling us men did it in order to get power and control. What they said was they ended up with all the power and all the control when they did this. And I always interpreted it as that women were saying men desired power and control. When I did my men's groups, I'd always think that you were desiring, but I never heard the men say that. And that's when I started to understand the difference between feeling entitled to that control and desiring it. Like as a white person, me feeling entitled to certain space wasn't a desire to dominate people of color. It's 2 different things, to want to dominate someone and to feel entitled to be in control. So I ended up not thinking that men wanted power and control. I ended up thinking and realizing that they felt entitled to it, which is a different way of talking to men about it. People will look at the power and control and say, well, a lot of people do that. But a lot of people don't attach to it the sexual abuse and the ability to beat someone up and the ability to scare someone, intimidate someone. So I can call you a name or something like that, but you can't say the abuse is the same. You know, it's almost like those other forms of abuse on that wheel are glued onto the violence, where they're kind of attached like this, and the violence shapes everything, and the ability to control someone's thoughts and their physical and sexual safety. That's what I think people don't understand when they try to equate women calling men names and telling them they're no good. And I mean, yes, that's emotionally abusive for a woman to put a man down and stuff like that. But he isn't living in this kind of fear that battering is all about. It's making someone afraid of their physical and sexual safety, and eventually being able to use that fear in a way that gives you pretty much total control over them, their thoughts, their sense of themselves. And to equate that to other relationships where people put each other down or call each other names and not understand what it means to introduce all the violence parts to it. That's what's so difficult in this day and age, that people still do not understand that. I have a friend who it was the first woman I ever advocated for, and her husband tried to kill her, and he died 4 or 5 years ago. And I called her up the day that he died, and this is like 20 years ago I advocated for her. And I said, how are you doing? How are the kids doing? She said, the kids are having a hard time. And she said, I had the best sleep that I've had in 25 years. And even after all that time, she still lived on some level, knowing that he was walking the earth and that he still hated her and he still was claiming that someday he would get her. She never slept well. And that night she slept well. Well, my goal is that women go to bed at night and they sleep well. They're not afraid that someone's going to break through, rape them, beat them, hurt their kids. And that's more than prosecuting a case, or it's more than any of these kind of individual things we do on a case. You know, there's been a lot of criticism of the battered women's movement not acknowledging that women use violence, that sometimes this violence is mutual, that it's not always about power and control. And some of that criticism is very legitimate. Some of it is bogus, but a lot of it is real, that domestic violence is anytime someone in an intimate relationship uses force or intimidation against another. Well, that's a pretty broad set of things. And the battered women's movement, as a social movement, meant to address a certain kind of domestic violence. It meant to address that top-down violence of somebody that's controlling another person, somebody that is dominating through the use of fear, violence, etc. There's been a lot of criticism of the battered women's movement over the years that we're not acknowledging that not all domestic violence is the same thing. And so we painted a picture that domestic violence was about one person dominating another, using all these tactics of control. And there's other forms of domestic violence. For one thing, the dominated person, oftentimes, most people don't just curl up and get hit. They fight back, they kick back, so there's a lot of violence coming back at the dominator. There's also violence that isn't about domination. It's violence that's attached more to a mental illness problem. Someone who's schizophrenic and becomes paranoid and starts to think that their wife is trying to poison them and uses violence against her might look like a case of, oh my God, this is domestic violence, he's dominating her. That's not what it is. So the criticism has been the lack of differentiation amongst these different kinds of violence. Some of it's really quite legitimate. Some of it is a lot of smoke screens going up because people want to say, you know, this is not a gender issue, this is really mutual. Well, that's just not true. There's a historic 6,000 years of this kind of violence of domination that we've got to get a hold of in this society, and it's destroying kids' lives, women's lives, etc. But there is this other kind of domestic violence, and so when you use the term domestic violence and write a policy, you can't say when there's domestic violence you do this. You have to say, is this person dominating this person? Is this person fighting back? Very few victims just curl up and get hit. They kick back, spit back, and sometimes they wait until he's a little under the weather, and then they get him back. So there's a lot of resistance. Nobody just gets dominated without in some way resisting. And a significant number of women resist in different ways, but violence is one of them. And so you have to treat resistance violence very different than dominating violence, because if you don't, you actually increase this person's power. If you say to her, we're going to arrest you, we're going to prosecute you, we're going to put you in a batterers group, we're going to do all this, he's going, yes, thank you. And you've just actually made the situation worse. So you got to figure out, how do you intervene in this person's violence without emboldening and empowering the dominator?
The first thing we know is that the domestic violence laws do not even begin to touch on the pattern of violence that exists in probably 90 to 95% of these relationships, and certainly in the vast majority of abusive relationships that come to the attention of the courts or the police or the healthcare system. The second thing that domestic violence laws do not even begin to reach is the following, and this is a paradox. Even though domestic violence is frequent, the typical domestic violence is minimal from a criminal justice or a medical standpoint. Now, what do I mean by that? Yes, domestic violence accounts for a large number of homicides, Yes, domestic violence is frequently accompanied by severe injury or sexual assault or rape. But in well over 90% of domestic violence incidents, no injury results. Not only does no injury result, but if someone from another planet, say, or someone who uses what I call a calculus of physical harms to assess severity, well, to look at the incident, it would seem trivial. There's a push, there's a shove, there's grabbing, there's holding, there's pulling hair. Any of these acts taken alone from a medical or a criminal justice standpoint seems like nothing. Unfortunate, maybe we would advise the person not to do it, but certainly not something that's going to excite a police officer or a criminal court judge or even a family court judge. So what has happened is that because we have a law that focuses on discrete incidents of violence, and because the vast majority of domestic violence incidents are trivial from a criminal justice or medical standpoint, the vast majority of domestic violence arrests and cases result in absolutely no sanctions that are significant enough or even approach significant enough to inhibit subsequent domestic violence crimes. In other words, what we've done by taking an incident-specific approach to domestic violence is effectively to turn domestic violence into a second-class misdemeanor for which almost no one goes to jail. But in the 60% of the cases where I believe the pattern of violence is complemented by this extended pattern of intimidation, isolation, and control, I believe a much more broad-based and fundamental crime needs to be identified, and we need to enforce it. I think that with the 60% of battering cases that comprise domestic violence, I think we need a law that punishes offenders at the same level that we would punish people who take hostages or kidnap people, because what we're really dealing with, although the analogy is by no means perfect, is a kind of domestic terrorism, a kind of domestic hostage-taking in which the victim has no outside to escape to because the supposed safe place, the relationship, the home, the family network, has been identified as the point of imprisonment and entrapment. So I think that while we can deal with some proportion of cases simply by reforming our current domestic violence laws and enforcing them more carefully by looking at the pattern of behavior as part of the crime rather than as recidivism, a repeat of a single crime, I think we need a fundamentally new criminal justice approach, and beyond that, a new social service approach to the liberty crime of coercive control.
My God,